The carriage wheels ground against the damp cobblestones of Beacon Hill, a sound that grated on Eleanor Thorne's nerves far more than it should have. She stood by the tall, lace-curtained window of the front parlour, her posture rigid, watching the arrival. It was late November in Boston, and the air was a biting, humid chill that seemed to seep through the very granite of the old houses. The sky was the color of faded slate, threatening the first real snowfall of the season, a perfect backdrop for the icy reception she was about to offer. Below, the carriage came to a halt. William, her older brother, emerged first. His usual robust energy seemed slightly strained, his movements too quick, as if he were eager to dispense with a formality. He offered a gloved hand to the woman who followed, Clara Prescott. Eleanor's grip tightened on the edge of the velvet drape. She measured Clara instantly. She was beautiful, certainly. A delicate frame, a cloud of dark, perfectly coiffed hair beneath a fashionable bonnet, and eyes, large, luminous eyes, that held a visible flicker of anxiety, an apprehension that was far more comforting to Eleanor than any show of confidence would have been. Clara was an outsider, a transplant from New York society, now arriving to occupy a space that, in Eleanor's mind, had been reserved for her alone for 28 years. William, oblivious to the silent, frigid scrutiny from the window, led Clara up the stone steps. The heavy oak front door was opened by Mrs. Gable, the ancient, taciturn housekeeper, whose expression of polite indifference was a shared sentiment with Eleanor. When they finally entered the parlour, the warmth of the roaring fire did little to dispel the tension. "Eleanor, dearest," William said, his voice a little too hearty, attempting to bridge the chasm of silence. He stepped forward to offer a brief, formal kiss on her cheek. "We are finally home. You remember Clara, of course." Eleanor turned slowly, composing her features into a mask of restrained civility. She was dressed in a deep sapphire gown that seemed to absorb the light, making her appear sharper, less yielding than the soft pastel hues Clara wore. "Welcome, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice low and carefully modulated, devoid of genuine warmth. "The journey was not too taxing, I trust." Clara offered a slight curtsy, her gloved hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Miss Thorne, thank you. It was long, but your beautiful home is a welcome sight. I'm simply delighted to finally be here." "Delighted," Eleanor thought, a cold flicker of possessiveness igniting in her chest. "You are merely a guest who has overstayed before arriving." William, sensing the air was too still, clapped his hands together. "Splendid. Clara, my love, I want you to feel this house is yours. Eleanor has seen to all the preparations. The East Wing is waiting. Eleanor, dear, perhaps you could escort Clara upstairs. I must see to the luggage and settle the driver." Eleanor inclined her head, a silent affirmation that was more of a mandate. "Of course, William. Come, Clara." The ascent up the grand, curving mahogany staircase was a journey of silent, escalating tension. Eleanor moved with a practiced grace, her silk skirt whispering against the wood. Clara followed, her breathing noticeably shallow. The house was enormous, filled with shadows cast by the afternoon's fading light, and decorated with heavy, dark furniture that spoke of generations of Thorne history. "This house," Clara ventured, trying to initiate conversation, "it's truly magnificent. So much history." "It is," Eleanor agreed, stopping on the landing. She turned, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Every brick, every portrait, every object has a history. It is a Thorne house. Always has been." She led Clara down a long corridor to the East Wing. The scent of polished wood and aged velvet was heavy in the air. The room was large and luxurious, with a massive four-poster bed and an ensuite dressing room. "I had the maid prepare a pot of strong tea for you," Eleanor said, gesturing to a small table by the window, where a silver teapot and 2 cups sat waiting. "And a light supper will be brought up shortly. I assumed you would prefer to rest before joining us for dinner." Clara gave a grateful sigh. "That is truly thoughtful of you, Miss Thorne. I am exhausted." We insist on proper form in this house, Clara. Proper rest is essential, Eleanor replied. Her eyes drifted to the tea service. The pot was steaming gently. The tea was a proprietary blend that William's late mother and now Eleanor insisted upon, a very specific, dark, herbal mixture. Please, do help yourself. I will send a maid up for your unpacking, Eleanor said. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the brass knob. She looked back at Clara, who was already removing her bonnet, a gesture of relief and vulnerability. Clara, Eleanor added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but her eyes were cold and unwavering. I hope you understand something. William is delicate, despite his appearance. He relies on routine. He relies on me. Any disruption, it is not received well. Clara looked up, her relief instantly dissolving into alarm. Miss Thorne, I assure you I would never wish to cause trouble. I intend to be the most dutiful of wives. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched Eleanor's lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. See that you are, for your sake, and William's. Eleanor closed the door, leaving Clara alone in the enormous, imposing room with the steaming teapot. The lock clicked softly. Outside the door, Eleanor did not move immediately. She pressed her back against the cool wood panel, closing her eyes. Her heart was a frantic drumbeat beneath her corseted bodice. She had done it. The stage was set. The atmosphere of doubt had been successfully introduced. She had implied a deep, hidden fragility in William and a clear threat to Clara's position, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted sister. She then walked down the hallway, her resolve hardening with every step. Her mind was already on the pantry, on the small, stoppered vial of colorless, odorless extract, a specific herbal preparation difficult to procure and a secret only she possessed. It was a potent, slow-acting, and ultimately untraceable agent of disruption. This marriage would not last. It could not last. The possession of William was a right, not a privilege, and no fragile New York beauty would ever take it from her. She reached the stairs and descended with a renewed purpose. The game had begun, and the first sip of the dark tea would be the first move. The mystery had been planted. Why is William delicate? And what does Eleanor truly intend? The suspense hung heavy in the silent house, a promise of the darkness that would unfold. Thank you for watching the first chapter of this terrifying story. The secrets of the Thorne family run deep, and Clara has only just stepped onto thin ice. To see how Eleanor's chilling plan unfolds and to follow this journey of psychological terror and mystery to the very end, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The days immediately following Clara's arrival settled into a strained routine, a false domesticity that felt brittle to the touch. Eleanor, operating with surgical precision, had ensured the first doses of the compound had been administered. The substance, a carefully refined extract from a common yet often misused local herb, was not lethal in the minute quantity used. Its purpose was far more insidious, to induce a pattern of fluctuating, inexplicable illness, mimicking a nervous affliction common among society women of the time. Clara, initially radiating a fragile hope, began to wilt. It started subtly, a persistent dull ache behind the eyes, dismissed by everyone as the fatigue of the long journey from New York. Then came the persistent, mild nausea, particularly after the tea Eleanor so kindly insisted upon in the afternoons. Soon the bouts of dizziness became more frequent, forcing Clara to retire early to the grand, oppressive East Wing bedroom. Eleanor watched, observed, and recorded every symptom in the cool, detached ledger of her mind. She became the picture of the dutiful, concerned sister-in-law. Clara, dear, you must take some more of this tonic, Eleanor insisted one chilly afternoon, holding out a delicate porcelain cup in the drawing room. The tea, prepared personally by Eleanor, had a slightly darker hue than usual. It's Mother's old blend for nerves. It settles the stomach. You look quite peaked. Clara, leaning back against the velvet sofa, her color noticeably pale, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. You are truly too kind. I feel so wretched that I've been such a poor companion to William." "Nonsense," Eleanor said, her voice soft and reassuring. "You simply require rest. Marriage is a strain, you know. New surroundings, new responsibilities. It affects the most robust of constitutions." Clara took a tentative sip. The taste was faintly metallic, almost bitter, but she dismissed it as the medicinal quality of the tonic. "Perhaps it is the air here in Boston. So damp." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, her eyes darting to the small mahogany desk where William was supposedly working on ledger books. William, however, was already displaying the desired signs of distress. He had begun his marriage filled with buoyant optimism, but Clara's increasingly unpredictable health cast a heavy pall over the household. He was the picture of frustrated devotion. That evening, Eleanor found William alone in the library, his brow furrowed, staring into the flickering gaslight. He had pushed his dinner plate away, mostly untouched. "Brother," Eleanor said softly, closing the heavy oak door behind her. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and wood polish. William sighed, rubbing his temples. "Eleanor, I am worried sick about Clara. She was fine, perfectly well, a month ago. Now she has these terrible spells. She can barely keep down her food. I had Dr. Peterson call upon her today, and he says it's merely nerves and fatigue. But I feel it's more." Eleanor moved to the massive globe in the corner, gently tracing a finger over North America. "Dr. Peterson is a man of limited imagination, William, but what else could it be? She is new to the household. Perhaps she is simply homesick. Perhaps she feels overwhelmed by her new role." She paused, letting the implication hang. "She's not strong enough for the Thorn name." William looked up, his expression deepening with guilt. "Do you think I rushed her? She seemed so happy during the engagement. I thought she was stronger. She is a delicate flower, William, and she relies entirely upon us now," Eleanor said, turning to face him fully. She walked closer, her posture radiating competence and stability. "She is relying on you for her happiness, and on me for the smooth running of this house, and frankly, for her daily comfort. Remember how Mother managed her ailments? Constant supervision, gentle routine. We must be patient, brother. And constant." She placed a comforting hand on his arm. Her touch was firm, solid, a stark contrast to Clara's increasingly fragile grip. William instinctively covered her hand with his own. "Thank you, Eleanor. I truly don't know what I would do without you. You understand this household, and me, better than anyone." The words were precisely what Eleanor needed. Possession affirmed. Over the next few days, the severity of Clara's symptoms subtly increased. She began to experience tremors in her hands, slight, barely perceptible but present. She started dropping small items. This led to moments of intense, tearful frustration, which further alienated William, who, though sympathetic, was becoming visibly exhausted by the constant illness. One morning, Clara was attempting to dress when she called out for a maid. Eleanor, intercepting the call, found her in the dressing room, gripping the edge of her vanity. "Eleanor, I can't seem to fasten the buttons," Clara whispered, tears welling up. Her fingers were trembling. "It's like my hands don't belong to me." Eleanor approached, her face a mask of sorrowful concern. "Oh, my dear, that is worrying." She helped Clara dress, her own hands steady and capable. As she did so, she subtly assessed the depth of the effect. The dosage was perfect, enough to cripple the will, but not enough to suggest immediate danger. The symptoms pointed towards a nervous breakdown, a common tragedy in the high-stress environment of 19th century society. "We must discuss with William the possibility of a trip to the countryside," Eleanor suggested, buttoning the final cuff. "A change of air is often recommended for such afflictions." "A trip," Clara said, her voice thin with anxiety. "But I just arrived. I don't want William to think I'm running away. William won't think that. He wants you well. And besides," Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice dropping, You can hardly manage the house in this state. It is best to rest fully until you are strong enough to manage your duties as Mrs. Thorne. The implication was clear. Clara was failing her primary role. The pressure, the silent mounting judgment, was part of Eleanor's masterful control. Later that week, during a small dinner attended only by the three of them, Clara made an attempt to be cheerful. She laughed at one of William's anecdotes, a bright, slightly desperate sound. But when she reached for her glass of water, her hand jerked violently. The water sloshed over the crisp white tablecloth. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara burst into tears, covering her face. "I am so sorry. I am becoming so clumsy. I don't know what is happening to me." William immediately went to her, his sympathy tinged with visible fatigue and bewilderment. "It is all right, my dear. Please do not distress yourself." Eleanor, however, remained seated, her expression a perfect blend of pity and weary resignation. She met William's eyes over Clara's weeping form. The message was clear, unspoken, and devastating. She is weak, she is deteriorating, and she is destroying the peace of this house. The mystery was no longer what was wrong with Clara, but how deeply rooted her affliction was, and how far it would drive a wedge between her and William. The suspense lay in waiting for the final fracture. Eleanor had secured her position as the stable constant, the silent anchor in the house's growing emotional storm. Clara's condition, though private, was not entirely secret. Whispers began to circulate among the narrow social circle the Thornes maintained. When William escorted Eleanor to a small, formal gathering hosted by their old friend, Mrs. Abernathy, the scrutiny was palpable. Clara had been deemed too fragile to attend, a decision Eleanor had encouraged with strategic concern. "William, dear boy, you look utterly drawn," Mrs. Abernathy remarked, clutching his hand with dramatic sympathy. She was a woman whose kindness was often overshadowed by her keen interest in local misfortunes. "And where is your lovely bride? We hear she is quite ill." William forced a tired smile. "She is convalescing, Mrs. Abernathy. Dr. Peterson insists she simply requires rest." Eleanor, standing calmly beside him, added with a sigh, "Clara is very sensitive. The adjustment to Boston life and the demands of the house have been taxing. We hope a few weeks will see her restored." Eleanor's words were carefully chosen. They didn't lie, yet they painted Clara as frail, perhaps even histrionic, a perception easier for society to accept than an unknown physical malady. The phrase "demands of the house" subtly suggested Clara was simply not up to the task of being Mrs. Thorne. Later that evening, Eleanor intercepted a friend of Clara's, a Miss Davies, by the punch bowl. "Miss Thorne, I must ask about Clara," Miss Davies began, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I received a note from her. She mentioned a terrible trembling in her hands. It sounded quite distressing." Eleanor leaned closer, adopting a tone of deep, confidential sorrow. "It is distressing, Miss Davies. Most distressing. William is beside himself. It began with simple nausea and fatigue, but now the tremors are pronounced, and the fits of weeping are becoming more frequent. Frankly, the physician has suggested it is a severe case of hysteria. The word, a common and damning diagnosis for women whose symptoms baffled 19th century doctors, landed like a stone. It carried a heavy social stigma, implying emotional instability and a weak moral character. "Hysteria?" Miss Davies gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, poor William." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "We are doing everything we can. We are keeping her calm, keeping her insulated, but it requires the utmost patience." The rumor was thus set loose. Clara was not merely ill, she was becoming mentally unstable. Back at the Thorne house, the atmosphere was suffocating. William, pressured by Eleanor's subtle reports and the society rumors he was beginning to hear, summoned Dr. Peterson for a more pointed consultation. The doctor, a man of conventional wisdom and limited diagnostic tools, sat opposite William in the library. Eleanor, positioned nearby, busied herself with needlework, a picture of quiet domestic support, yet listening intently to every word. Dr. Peterson, I must insist. Clara is not improving. The tremors are worse. She has difficulty writing a simple note. Is it truly just nerves? William asked, his voice raw with worry and growing doubt. Dr. Peterson adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Thorne, I have examined your wife thoroughly. Her pulse is steady, her breathing regular. There are no obvious signs of a fever or internal disease. However, the manifestation of physical symptoms, the nausea, the dizziness, the motor control issues, coupled with her emotional state, points strongly to a severe neurasthenia or hysterical affliction. Eleanor lifted her head slightly, her needles momentarily still. Perfect. The medical consensus was exactly what she needed to fully discredit Clara. We see this in women of high sensibility, the doctor continued, tapping his cane on the polished floor. The stress of a new marriage, the move to Boston, it is often too much for them. The mind manifests its distress through the body. My advice remains quiet, rest, and complete cessation of social or domestic duties. And above all, no undue excitement. So she is not physically ill? William pressed, desperation in his tone. Her body is expressing the turmoil of her mind, Mr. Thorne. Treat the mind and the body will follow. William slumped back in his chair, defeated. He had hoped for a simple diagnosis, a treatment, a cure. Instead, he had a pronouncement of his wife's profound instability. As Dr. Peterson prepared to leave, Eleanor followed him to the hall. Doctor, she murmured, catching his sleeve, her voice full of controlled distress. Are these conditions reversible, or could they deteriorate further? The doctor lowered his voice. Miss Thorne, if the patient is not kept calm, if she is exposed to stress or made to feel she is failing, yes, it can become a permanent state. A woman can lose her mental faculties entirely. It requires a calm, strong influence to guide her. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes wide with a perfect imitation of fear and resolution. I understand, Doctor. I will continue to be that strong influence. When William came out of the library, he looked broken. He found Eleanor waiting. She's not ill, Eleanor, he said, his voice a haunted whisper. She's unstable. My wife is becoming an invalid, and it's my fault for forcing this on her. Eleanor gently placed her hand on his cheek, a gesture of deep, non-romantic intimacy, the connection of shared fate. It is no one's fault, William. It is a tragedy, but we will manage it. You have me. We will take care of her. The mystery of Clara's illness was now pathologically solved in the eyes of society and the medical community. The suspense had shifted to Eleanor's next move. How would she leverage this diagnosis of hysteria to remove Clara permanently without causing William to suspect foul play? The foundation for the final, devastating move was set. The decision to move Clara to the country was presented by Eleanor as an act of mercy, a necessary response to the doctor's dire warning. The Thorne family maintained a modest, isolated retreat, a hunting lodge, deep in the sparsely populated woods of western Massachusetts. It was a place of enforced quiet, miles from the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of Boston society. William, convinced he was doing the best for his afflicted wife, arranged the move with a heavy heart. He would stay in Boston to manage his affairs, but would visit Clara every Sunday. Eleanor, of course, volunteered to accompany Clara full-time. It is my duty, William, she stated, her tone firm and sacrificial. She is a stranger here, and in her fragile state, she requires a familiar face. I cannot leave her to the care of strangers. William embraced her tightly, gratitude washing over his exhaustion. Thank you, Eleanor. You are truly a blessing. Take Mrs. Gable with you and sufficient staff. Spare no expense for her comfort. The journey was harrowing for Clara. She was pale and listless, the tremors now so pronounced that she could barely hold a teacup without spilling. She clung to William's hand at the Boston train station, her eyes pleading. William, please don't send me away. I feel better when you are here, she whispered, her voice weak. Nonsense, my love, William said, forcing cheerfulness. This is only for a few weeks, until the fresh air restores you. Eleanor will be there. You will be completely quiet. You will be well again. The lie was necessary, yet it tore at him. He was truly terrified of her emotional instability, convinced that the slightest stress could send her further into the abyss of hysteria. The lodge was remote and austere. Built of dark, unpolished timber, it stood surrounded by dense, leafless forest, silent under the heavy, grey winter sky. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Isolation was absolute. Upon arrival, Eleanor took immediate control. She assigned Clara the most isolated bedroom, facing the woods, a room perpetually shrouded in shadows, even at midday. Mrs. Gable, a silent and obedient witness, managed the small staff. The regimen was strict and Eleanor's own invention. Long periods of mandated quiet, simple, often unappetizing meals, and mandatory consumption of the special tonic, which, of course, contained a slightly increased dosage of the paralyzing compound. The effects were designed to be confusing and terrifying for Clara, yet entirely consistent with the diagnosis of neurasthenia. One afternoon, sitting alone with Eleanor by a small, crackling fire, Clara was trying to write a letter to her parents, her trembling hands making the script illegible. "I don't understand, Eleanor. I am resting. I am quiet. But I feel worse here," Clara said, her voice choked with despair. "The tremors, they frighten me. I feel like I am losing control of my own body." Eleanor looked up from her book, her expression serene and patronizing. "That is the nature of the affliction, Clara. When the mind is in turmoil, the body follows. Perhaps you are fighting the treatment. You must surrender to the quiet. You must allow your mind to empty itself." "But I am not in turmoil," Clara cried, a rare flash of spirit. "I am anxious, yes, but only because I am ill. I want to be well for William." Eleanor simply raised a perfect skeptical eyebrow. "Indeed, the doctor and William believe otherwise, and if you continue to argue against the counsel given, you only prove their judgment correct. Now drink your tea, dear. It will calm your spirits." The psychological torture was intensifying. Eleanor was not just poisoning Clara's body. She was meticulously poisoning Clara's mind with self-doubt, using the external consensus of hysteria as her weapon. Clara began to have moments of clarity, fleeting suspicions that Eleanor's help was too thorough, too constant. She noticed Eleanor insisted on preparing her tonic tea herself, that no one else was allowed near the specialized herbs she claimed to use. One evening, while Eleanor was momentarily called away, Clara, driven by a terrible intuitive fear, approached the teapot on the side table. It was the same silver pot used since the day she arrived in Boston. She hesitated, her hand shaking violently. It wasn't the trembling of her illness, but the tremor of pure terror. She quickly lifted the lid. The tea was dark, thick, and smelled medicinal. She dipped a finger in, a reckless action, and brought it to her tongue. The taste was familiar, the bitter, metallic note she had come to associate with her illness, but this time she noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible floral undertone, distinct from any common tea. She looked around the deserted room, her heart hammering. This was no ordinary tonic. The mystery was no longer the cause of her illness, but the identity of the substance and its sinister purpose. The suspense was the terrifying realization that the person closest to her, the one charged with her care, was the source of her affliction. Clara was now awake, isolated, and in imminent danger. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she was trapped in the middle of nowhere with her silent executioner. Clara's internal struggle had shifted from resignation to desperate alertness. The realization that Eleanor was poisoning her was a chilling, isolating terror. She could trust no one. She was miles from civilization, her only company the woman actively destroying her, a taciturn housekeeper, and indifferent staff. The only one who could save her, William, was convinced of her mental instability. She had to act, but every action required immense painful effort, as her limbs felt increasingly heavy and unresponsive due to the cumulative effect of the compound. The next few days became a careful ballet of avoidance. Clara would pretend to drink the tonic tea, holding the cup to her lips, but finding an opportune moment, a glance away from Eleanor, a cough, to tip a fraction of the liquid into the thick Persian rug or a hidden potted plant. The tremors, however, were now a constant, terrifying companion, making any deception difficult. Eleanor, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound sense of security. The isolation had intensified her control. She moved through the lodge with an air of absolute, unchallenged authority. One morning, Eleanor went down to the kitchen to consult with Mrs. Gable about the week's menu, a task she usually delegated. Clara, seizing the opportunity, forced her trembling body out of bed. She crept down the hallway to Eleanor's small private study, which was always locked. The lock was an old, simple mechanism. Clara found a thin hairpin from her dressing table, and with agonizing slowness and fighting the constant tremor, she worked the delicate wire into the lock. It took nearly 10 minutes, the silence of the remote lodge amplifying the frantic rhythm of her heart. Click. She slipped inside. The room was cold, neat, and ruthlessly organized. Her eyes immediately scanned the area for a vial, a container, anything that would confirm her suspicions. She found it not in a grand cabinet, but tucked discreetly into a small, locked carved wooden box in the bottom drawer of the desk. She used the hairpin again on the miniature lock. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a small, perfectly labeled glass vial containing a pale, clear liquid. The label was a neat, precise script. Gelsemium sempervirens, for study. Clara had never heard the name, but the chilling realization of its contents hit her like a physical blow. The fact that it was locked away, secreted, and precisely measured was the undeniable proof. Eleanor was systematically attempting to eliminate her. She quickly closed the box and the drawer, scrambling back to her room just as she heard Eleanor's footsteps returning to the hallway. When William arrived that Sunday, the atmosphere was a masterpiece of carefully managed tragedy. William rushed to Clara, embracing her with desperate affection. "My love, how are you? Eleanor says you are resting well." Clara forced herself to appear weak but rational. "William, I'm glad you are here. I feel very alone." "I know, my dear. But the isolation is necessary," the doctor said. "You seem very pale." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide, trying to convey a silent warning. "William, I feel my mind is clearer, but my body is failing me. I feel weak, and I am concerned about the tonic Eleanor is giving me." William's face immediately hardened with concern, but it was the wrong kind of concern. He saw it as a symptom of her paranoia, the hysteria manifesting as suspicion. "My dearest, you must trust Eleanor. She is sacrificing everything to care for you. Her tonic is merely an herbal blend that Mother always used. It is meant to soothe your nerves. You must not allow your fears to lead you to distrust the people who love you." Just then, Eleanor entered, carrying a tray with 3 fresh cups of tea. She was a vision of patient domestic sacrifice. "Here we are," she said brightly. "William, I have prepared your favorite, and Clara dear, you must drink yours. It is still warm." Clara watched, horrified, as Eleanor handed her the cup. She saw William's trusting gaze shift from her to his sister. She knew in that moment she could not simply refuse. It would confirm William's fears of her instability. Eleanor sat down, sipping her own tea, her eyes watching Clara with polite, unblinking expectation. Clara had to choose: drink the poison and continue her slow death, or refuse and be condemned as irrational and hysterical, losing William's last shred of belief. A small, crucial detail registered. Mrs. Gable stood silently in the doorway, waiting to clear the tray. Her eyes met Clara's for a fleeting second. Mrs. Gable was known to despise Eleanor's patronizing control and her usurpation of the late Mrs. Thorne's domestic authority. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. She had one chance to communicate the truth, a message that must be understood by the only silent witness in the room. Clara brought the cup to her lips, her hand shaking so violently the liquid nearly spilled. Then, intentionally, she allowed the tremor to seize her hand completely. The cup went flying, shattering against the stone hearth. The dark liquid splattered across the stone, and the fragments of porcelain scattered. "I cannot!" Clara cried, covering her face in a perfect performance of mental collapse, yet her message was dual-layered. A breakdown for William, a purposeful refusal for Eleanor, and a crucial, broken vessel for the silent observer. William rushed to her, horrified. Eleanor was composed, but a flicker of frustrated rage crossed her face. "See, William," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "She is fighting the help. She is deteriorating." The mystery of the compound was now confirmed to Clara. The suspense had reached a terrifying pitch. Clara had destroyed the evidence, but in doing so, had she also permanently cemented her image as an insane woman in William's eyes? And had the silent observer, Mrs. Gable, seen the defiance or only the madness? Following the incident with the shattered teacup, William left the lodge in a state of profound despair. His conviction of Clara's hysteria tragically solidified. He promised to send a specialist from New York, a renowned psychiatrist, but in the interim, he entrusted Clara's care entirely to Eleanor. Eleanor seized the opportunity to tighten her control. Her facade of patient kindness was replaced by a rigid, chilling authority. Meals were now served under her direct supervision. The tonic was no longer tea, but a concentrated liquid administered with a spoon, leaving Clara no room for evasion. The increased forced dosage of gelsemium extract had a swift and devastating effect. The muscle weakness, or myasthenia, worsened rapidly. Clara was barely able to walk, relying on the walls or a cane. Her speech became slurred, her vision blurred. She was becoming a prisoner in her own failing body. Eleanor confronted her in her room one afternoon. Clara was propped up in bed, looking spectral against the white pillows. "You are failing, Clara," Eleanor stated, her voice flat and utterly devoid of emotion. She held the small vial in her hand, twirling it slowly, a deliberate, cruel taunt. "You fight my care and look at the result. You will soon be unable to do anything but lie here and wait for the rest of your mind to follow your body." Clara tried to speak, but her mouth felt sluggish. William belongs here. To this house. To me," Eleanor hissed, leaning close. Her breath was cool on Clara's cheek. "You stole his affection with your pretty face and your fleeting charm, but charm fades, stability lasts. And I am the stability this house requires. I am the only one who can manage him. You are merely an inconvenient interruption." Eleanor was giving Clara the horrifying truth, confirming the motive. Forbidden possession. She knew Clara was too weak to move, too slurred to convince anyone. This was Eleanor's victory lap. Clara, however, now knew the full extent of the plot. She knew the name of the poison. Her mind, despite the body's failure, was clear and focused. "You will not get away with this," Clara managed, the words agonizingly slow. Eleanor laughed softly, a dry, rustling sound. "Oh, but I already have, my dear. The doctor confirms you are hysterical. William believes you are descending into madness. Soon you will be utterly mute and immobile, and the official cause will be extreme nervous exhaustion. I will mourn you beautifully, and William will be devastated, but he will have me, his constant, stable sister, to lean upon in his grief." She administered the spoonful of the poison. Clara swallowed it, but the chilling confession had ignited a final, burning defiance. Later that day, Mrs. Gable entered the room to empty the chamber pot and change the linens. She moved with her usual silent, robotic efficiency. Clara knew this was her last chance. She struggled to sit up, her body protesting with a wave of dizziness. She pointed a shaking, almost useless finger at the small writing desk, and then to the top drawer. She could not speak clearly enough to form the word pen. Mrs. Gable looked at her, her expression unreadable. She had witnessed the shattered cup, the swift decline, and the suffocating control of Eleanor. She knew something was fundamentally wrong. She was an observer, not a participant, but the injustice of the situation was starting to grate against her rigid moral code. Mrs. Gable slowly walked to the desk. She opened the drawer and retrieved a small, leather-bound journal Clara had brought with her and a pencil. She placed them on Clara's lap. Clara's hands were useless for writing. She knew the poison was destroying her motor skills. The letters she wrote had to be a single, undeniable piece of evidence. With an immense, desperate expenditure of effort, Clara gripped the pencil with both hands, steadying it with a monumental effort of will. She pressed the point hard against the paper and began to drag the pencil, not writing full words but drawing a large, crude symbol. She drew a large, unmistakable X on the first page. Below the X, she painstakingly, agonizingly, drew a simple, easily identifiable image, a crude outline of a snake. She pushed the journal toward Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper looked down. She saw the X, the serpent, and then slowly she looked back up at the terrified, paralyzed woman in the bed. Clara mouthed a single, desperate word, though it was only a whisper. Poison. Mrs. Gable, the silent observer, finally registered the truth. The X, the mark of death or warning, and the snake, the universal symbol of treachery and poison, written by a woman deemed too hysterical to manage a conversation. She had her proof, not spoken, but drawn. The mystery was now solved for the last key person in the house. The suspense was the terrifying question of whether Mrs. Gable, a servant bound by fear and convention, would risk everything to act upon this silent, desperate confession and expose the terrible truth of Eleanor's forbidden possession. Mrs. Gable retreated to the solitude of the kitchen, the image of the crude X and the serpent, a snake in the bosom, burning in her mind. Her internal conflict was agonizing. She was a professional housekeeper, bound by decades of service and a deep-seated fear of social upheaval. To accuse Miss Eleanor Thorne, the beloved sister and heir to the house's domestic authority, of attempted murder was unthinkable. It meant ruin, scandal, and likely dismissal with a black mark against her name. But the memory of Clara, pale and paralyzed, fighting for her life and sanity, was a moral anchor. The girl was dying, not of hysteria, but of a calculated, cold-blooded plot. Mrs. Gable, though taciturn, was deeply religious and believed in justice. She spent the afternoon in a state of tense observation. She watched Eleanor move with an air of absolute impunity, ordering staff, reviewing accounts, and making the next measured dose of the tonic. Eleanor's calm, competent demeanor was the most terrifying confirmation of guilt. Mrs. Gable knew she could not confront Eleanor directly. Eleanor would simply deny it, and the word of a hysterical mistress and a housekeeper would never stand against the respected Miss Thorne. She needed concrete evidence. That evening, after Eleanor had settled down in the parlor with a book, Mrs. Gable made her move. She went to the laundry room, retrieved an old, unwashed flannel cloth, and then, armed with the knowledge of where the poison was hidden, crept up the back stairs to Eleanor's small study. She picked the lock of the desk drawer again, using the hairpin. She retrieved the small, locked wooden box. This time she didn't open it. She took the box, wrapped it tightly in the flannel cloth, and tucked it securely beneath her heavy woolen shawl. The challenge now was getting the evidence to William. Eleanor had strictly controlled all communication and movement in and out of the lodge. The nearest train station was 10 miles away, and the snow that had been threatening since their arrival was now falling heavily, isolating the lodge completely. Mrs. Gable knew none of the other staff would dare help her. Their loyalty was to the current power structure, Eleanor. She had to go herself. She waited until after midnight. The lodge was completely silent, the only sound the wind whistling through the pines and the gentle shush of falling snow. Eleanor had retired, but Mrs. Gable knew her to be a light sleeper. Dressed in her warmest, darkest layers, Mrs. Gable left her small room and descended the back stairs. The air was frigid. She found her heavy outdoor boots and coat in the scullery. She then approached the front door. Just as she reached for the latch, a low voice cut through the darkness of the hall. Mrs. Gable, where are you going? Eleanor stood at the end of the hall, wearing a dark velvet dressing gown, holding a small oil lamp. Her face, half lit by the dim flame, was a mask of cold suspicion. Mrs. Gable froze. The wooden box, wrapped in the flannel, felt heavy and incriminating beneath her shawl. Miss Thorne, Mrs. Gable said, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. I was just checking the latches. The wind is quite fierce tonight, and the snow is beginning to drift. Eleanor slowly walked closer, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows. The latches are the responsibility of the footman, Mrs. Gable. You have been with this family for 30 years. You know your duties. She stopped directly in front of the housekeeper, her eyes fixed on the outline of the concealed object under the shawl. What is that you are hiding, Mrs. Gable? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderbolt. Your shawl seems oddly bulky. Mrs. Gable's mind raced. She could not run. She could not lie about what she held. She had to find a plausible, mundane reason for the bulge. It is my knitting, Miss Thorne, Mrs. Gable said, holding herself rigid. I have been working on a scarf for my nephew, and I forgot it in the scullery earlier. I couldn't sleep without retrieving it. Eleanor stood there for a terrible, prolonged moment. She didn't believe the story. She could see the fear in the older woman's eyes, and she knew the box was missing from her desk. Let me see it, Mrs. Gable, Eleanor commanded, her voice hardening. The standoff was absolute. Mrs. Gable knew that to reveal the box was to lose her only evidence. She took a deep breath, and in that moment, the old, tired housekeeper found a spark of righteous courage. No, Miss Thorne, she said firmly, looking directly into Eleanor's frigid eyes. It is a private matter, and my duties for the night are completed. I am retiring. She turned, her back to the younger woman, a profound act of defiance. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the back stairs. Eleanor did not move immediately. The shock of being openly disobeyed by a lifetime servant held her momentarily frozen. As Mrs. Gable reached the stairs, she looked back. Eleanor was watching her, the lamplight illuminating a terrifying expression of rage and calculation. The silent war had just turned openly hostile. Mrs. Gable retreated to her room, her heart pounding. She had saved the evidence, but she was now marked. She knew she had to get the box to William immediately. The snow was her enemy, but the lodge, with Eleanor in control, was her certain tomb. You are now halfway through this terrifying story. The sisters' wicked plot is exposed, but the evidence is trapped with a frightened servant miles from help. The next few chapters promise a deadly confrontation and a desperate race against time. To see if Clara is saved and how Eleanor's chilling plan unravels, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. The moment Eleanor realized the wooden box was missing from her study, she knew Mrs. Gable had betrayed her. The knitting lie was transparent. The housekeeper hadn't simply disobeyed. She had stolen the evidence, the vial of Gelsemium sempervirens, and was clearly planning to deliver it to William. Eleanor's initial shock dissolved into cold fury and swift action. She changed out of her dressing gown and into heavy outdoor attire. She had to stop the old woman before the dawn. Mrs. Gable, meanwhile, was already moving. She knew a servant couldn't simply summon a carriage at 3 a.m. She had only one recourse, the stable. She made her way to the small, dark stables behind the lodge, the wind howling. She quickly saddled the fastest horse, William's own favorite gelding, Shadow, a reckless move that would be instantly noticed but necessary. She tied the flannel-wrapped box securely inside her coat. Just as she was leading Shadow out of the stall, a dark figure emerged from the shadows of the tack room. You won't leave the grounds, Mrs. Gable. Eleanor stood there, holding a riding crop, not as a symbol of domestic authority, but as a weapon. Her eyes glittered in the dim stable light. Miss Thorne, I must go. It is a matter of life and death, Mrs. Gable said, trying to maintain her composure. It is a matter of my rightful possession, old woman, Eleanor hissed. And you will not interfere. Eleanor sprang forward, surprising the older woman with her speed and strength. She struck out with the heavy end of the riding crop, catching Mrs. Gable's arm. The force of the blow was stunning. Mrs. Gable cried out, dropping the reins. She stumbled back, clutching her arm, but her resolve was unbroken. She knew she was fighting not just for her life, but for Clara's. "She is dying because of your jealousy," Mrs. Gable choked out. "You will hang for this, Miss Thorne." "No one will believe a hysterical wife and a disloyal servant," Eleanor yelled, advancing, preparing to strike again. Mrs. Gable, however, had the advantage of location. She knew the stable layout intimately. She grabbed a pitchfork from the wall, holding the handle low and defensively. "Stay back, Miss Thorne. I will defend myself." Eleanor hesitated. She was not a brute. She was a calculated killer. A fight with a pitchfork was too messy, too loud. It would certainly alert the sleeping staff. She could not risk a murder being discovered on the spot. "You have signed your own death warrant, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor spat, "but I will not make a scene here. You will freeze before you reach the station, and the box will be lost in the snow." Eleanor turned and raced out of the stables, leaving Mrs. Gable with the pitchfork. Mrs. Gable knew Eleanor wouldn't simply give up. She had to hurry. She mounted Shadow clumsily, the fear and pain making her movements awkward. The horse bolted out into the driving snow, heading down the barely visible track leading away from the lodge. The ride was a nightmare. The snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets, making the road treacherous and obscuring landmarks. Shadow was a fast horse, but the terrain was working against them. Mrs. Gable, unused to hard riding, clung to the saddle, her injured arm throbbing with terrible pain. After 20 minutes of furious riding, she heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of a galloping horse behind her. Eleanor was pursuing her, likely on a fresher mount, unburdened by fear or pain. Mrs. Gable pressed Shadow harder, urging him through the deep drifts. She realized the trail would soon hit a treacherous icy ravine, known locally as Devil's Trench. It was a dangerous shortcut, but if she could cross it, she might gain enough ground to reach the train station before the morning train departed for Boston. She reached the edge of the ravine. It was a steep, ice-slicked drop, barely visible in the dark. It was a route meant for men on foot, not horses. It was suicide. But the sound of the pursuit was closer now. Eleanor was gaining. Clutching the reins and the precious box, Mrs. Gable shut her eyes and pushed Shadow over the edge of the ravine. The horse screamed, scrambling for purchase on the icy slope. They slid, fell, and finally landed hard on the snow-packed floor of the trench. Mrs. Gable was thrown clear, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The air rushed out of her lungs. She lay stunned for a minute, the snow quickly settling over her. She coughed, testing her limbs. Her arm was broken, her body bruised, but she was alive. She reached inside her coat. The wooden box was still there. She heard the sound of the second horse pulling up sharply at the top of the ravine. She heard Eleanor's frantic shout, "You old fool, you'll freeze down there." Mrs. Gable pushed herself up, finding Shadow miraculously standing, though lame. She could not ride him. She was on foot, but she was hidden, and the ravine was a temporary shelter. The suspense had reached its peak. A foot race through the snowy wilderness, with an injured elderly woman carrying the only evidence of murder, pursued by a desperate, enraged killer who knew the woods intimately. Mrs. Gable had gained a moment, but Eleanor would find a way down. The race to the train station was on. Mrs. Gable struggled through the woods at the bottom of the ravine, dragging her broken body toward the train line. The cold was a heavy, numbing pain. She had managed to retrieve the vial from the box and wrap it securely in a small piece of flannel, abandoning the cumbersome wooden box. She knew the vial was the only thing that mattered. She reached the train line, a single set of tracks barely visible under the snow, just as the first grey light of dawn was breaking. In the distance, she heard the mournful whistle of the 5:30 a.m. train to Boston. She was moments from safety or utter failure. She stumbled onto the small, frigid and nearly deserted platform of the regional station. She found the station master, a sleepy, bewildered man, and gasped out her need to get to Boston to speak with Mr. William Thorne immediately. Just as the train was pulling in, its massive steam engine hissing and coughing, Mrs. Gable saw a dark figure on horseback emerge from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Eleanor. Her face was grim, frozen with a look of murderous resolve. Eleanor dismounted instantly and began to run toward the platform. "Stop her, she's a thief!" Eleanor screamed, pointing at Mrs. Gable. Her voice was sharp and commanding, the voice of the aristocracy. The stationmaster hesitated, but the authority in Eleanor's voice was compelling. "The old woman is a deranged runaway. She is not to be trusted," Eleanor shouted, gaining ground. Mrs. Gable knew she had to get on that train. She was too injured to fight, too weak to outrun Eleanor. She turned and threw her body toward the open door of the last carriage. Just as Eleanor lunged, grabbing a fistful of Mrs. Gable's coat, the train gave a violent lurch and began to accelerate. The force pulled Eleanor off balance. She lost her grip and fell onto the platform, hitting the icy wood hard. Mrs. Gable, half dragged, half pushed herself into the carriage, collapsing onto the dusty bench. She was alive, and the poison vial was secure. The journey to Boston was a blur of pain, fear, and resolve. Upon arriving at the bustling Boston terminal, Mrs. Gable immediately found a dock worker and, through choked, painful words, offered him all the money she had to summon a police officer. Within the hour, William Thorne was standing in his drawing room, facing 2 uniformed officers and a barely conscious, physically battered Mrs. Gable. He was utterly bewildered. Mrs. Gable was wrapped in a thick blanket, her arm crudely bandaged, her face bruised and pale. William knelt by her side. "Mrs. Gable, what in God's name happened to you? Was it a fall? Why did you leave the lodge?" Mrs. Gable took a huge, shuddering breath, her eyes locking onto William's. "Mr. Thorne, you must listen to me, your wife, Clara. She is not hysterical. She is being poisoned by Miss Eleanor." William's face went white. He recoiled as if struck. "Silence, woman! You are raving! Eleanor has sacrificed everything to care for her." "I have proof, sir," Mrs. Gable rasped. She weakly reached into her coat and pulled out the small piece of flannel. She unfolded it, revealing the tiny vial of clear liquid. "This, sir. It is poison. I took it from Miss Eleanor's locked desk. She admitted to your wife what she was doing. She confessed her jealousy. She tried to stop me from bringing this to you. She attacked me, sir." William was shaking his head, refusing to look at the vial. The officers were exchanging skeptical glances. "Mrs. Gable, you have been a loyal servant, but this accusation is monstrous," William said, his voice trembling with denial. "My sister would never—" "It is Gelsemium sempervirens, Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Gable cut in, using the name Clara had confirmed. "A subtle nerve poison. It mimics hysteria. Have the vial analyzed, please, William, before your wife dies." One of the officers, a sturdy, practical man, intervened. "Mr. Thorne, we cannot ignore an accusation of this nature, especially with a physical piece of evidence and injuries on the claimant. We must investigate." He gently took the vial. William, seeing the officer's professional seriousness, finally looked at the vial, then at the bruised, loyal face of the housekeeper, and a terrible, cold certainty began to settle in his heart. Eleanor's constant presence, her overbearing help, the diagnosis of hysteria, it suddenly all twisted into a sinister, coherent pattern. "We must go back to the lodge," William whispered, his world shattering around him. "Now, and bring a doctor." The mystery of Clara's illness was now undeniably solved for William, confirmed by the evidence and the servant's confession. The suspense was the horrific realization that Eleanor was still at the lodge, alone with a paralyzed Clara, and that the sister who coveted him would now know she was exposed. The final, desperate confrontation was imminent. The journey back to the lodge was a nightmare of cold, brutal realization for William Thorne. He rode with the 2 police officers and Dr. Peterson, who was perplexed and horrified by the revelation of the poison. The police had sent the vial for an immediate preliminary analysis at the Boston laboratory, confirming Mrs. Gable's claim. A toxic alkaloid, consistent with gelsemium, was present. They arrived at the lodge in the late afternoon. The house was unnaturally silent. The front door was slightly ajar, disturbed by Eleanor's hurried exit and return. William, half mad with fear and self-recrimination, rushed past the officers and up the stairs to Clara's room. He found Eleanor sitting calmly by Clara's bedside, holding a spoon to Clara's mouth. Clara was a terrible sight. Her eyes were dull, her complexion ashen, and her breathing shallow. She could not move. She was in the final stages of paralysis. "Eleanor!" William roared, his voice thick with a rage he had never known. Eleanor looked up, her expression one of utter, cold surprise. "William, you returned early. I was just giving Clara her final dose of the tonic. She's been so difficult today." William rushed forward, knocking the spoon from her hand. It clattered to the floor. "It's not tonic, Eleanor, it's poison," William shouted, gripping her arm so hard his knuckles turned white. "Mrs. Gable told me everything, the vial, the gelsemium. You've been poisoning my wife." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Her mask of propriety shattered, revealing a face contorted by fury and betrayal. "That miserable, disloyal servant!" She shrieked. She wrenched her arm free. She lied. "It was necessary, William. Can't you see? Clara is weak. She would have ruined you. She would have destroyed the Thorne name with her fragility. I was protecting you." She backed away from him, her eyes blazing with the intensity of her possessiveness. "I am the only one who truly understands you, the only one who can manage this house. I have always belonged here by your side. She was the intruder. You tried to murder her out of jealousy." William stammered, horrified by the viciousness of her confession. He turned to Clara, who was trying desperately to communicate, her eyes filling with tears of relief and exhaustion. At that moment, the two police officers, having heard the commotion and the shouted confession, entered the room. "Miss Thorne," the lead officer stated formally, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Mrs. Clara Thorne." Eleanor laughed, a high, unnatural, hysterical sound that filled the room. "Arrest? For protecting my family? This is preposterous. It is all a lie. She is hysterical. She is mad. Can't you see how she looks?" She pointed a trembling finger at Clara, a final, desperate attempt to invoke the consensus of hysteria. "The substance has been identified, Miss Thorne," the officer said grimly. "It is a paralytic poison. Dr. Peterson has confirmed the symptoms match the drug's effects." The doctor, standing by the bedside, confirmed the diagnosis with a sober nod. He quickly began administering an emetic and a counter-stimulant, knowing the critical nature of Clara's condition. Eleanor, realizing the cold, hard logic of the law would not be swayed by her passion, finally collapsed. Her forbidden possession of William, the life she had so meticulously planned, had been exposed by a frail, poisoned victim and a loyal, wounded servant. She offered no further resistance. She was escorted out of the lodge, passing a distraught but vindicated Mrs. Gable, who was watching from the lower landing. Clara survived. The dosage, though severe, had been slow and deliberate, giving the doctor time to counteract the poison. Her recovery was slow and arduous, marked by months of physical therapy to overcome the damage to her nervous system. William, consumed by guilt and the shocking reality of his sister's pathology, devoted himself entirely to her care. The trial of Eleanor Thorne was the sensation of 1853. The evidence was irrefutable. The vial, the analysis, Mrs. Gable's testimony, and the recovered pages of Clara's journal, which documented her suspicions before her body failed her. Eleanor was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, not death, due to her social standing and the prosecution's desire to avoid a public execution. The ruling solidified the fact that her crime was an act of profound, calculated human wickedness, not a product of the supernatural. William and Clara eventually moved away from Boston, selling the Grand Thorne house. They left behind the shadows of Eleanor's obsession and the crippling weight of the forbidden possession. Clara never fully regained her former strength, but her mind was sharp and her courage was absolute. Her marriage to William was forged in the fire of near tragedy, based not on superficial affection, but on the profound shared trauma of surviving Eleanor's terrifying psychological plot. She became a pillar of quiet strength, a testament to the resilience of a human spirit that refused to be possessed or destroyed. The mystery was solved. Cold, human calculation. The suspense was resolved. Justice and survival